Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. How medieval people survived without bathing. It was one of those cold autumn nights when the wind slipped through the cracks in the wooden windows and silence settled over the rooftops like a heavy blanket. I remember sitting near the hearth, my ankles warmed by the flames, and the rest of my body wrapped in layers of wool and linen, and frankly, in a smell that would make even the kindest perfumer recoil today. Because back then, dear listener, bathing wasn't a habit, it was a suspicion. A risk. Some claimed that water, especially cold water, opened the pores and let disease in. Others, more pious, feared that prolonged nudity before oneself and before God was a gateway to sin. It wasn't that we didn't like being clean, but cleanliness was something else entirely, almost philosophical. Purity of spirit was worth more than having dirt-free hands or dustless hair. On holy days, the soul was washed with prayers. The body, if necessary, was rubbed with a dry cloth and a handful of herbs. Soap? A luxury. Made from animal fat and ashes, it was reserved for clothes, or the wealthy. The rest of us made do with coarse cloths, apple cider vinegar, dried rosemary and, heaven forgive us, crushed garlic behind the ears. A simple gesture, they said, to ward off evil spirits. But in practice, it was the closest thing we had to deodorant. There were, of course, public baths, steam houses, damp chambers, large wooden tubs where bodies met among mists and murmurs. But even those spaces, which once thrived in Roman times, began to fall out of favor. Plagues, pestilence, and the fiery sermons of clerics made water suspicious. After all, wasn't it through the flesh that Eve sinned? What if washing the body too often was, in some way, a way of provoking it? The more devout began to see bathing as a frivolity, even a temptation. Better to carry the scent of penance than the perfume of vanity. Still, the human nose has its limits, even the medieval one. So we developed tricks. Layers upon layers of clothing absorbed the sweat of long days, but also hid it. Dressing well often meant smelling bad with elegance. Women wore sachets of herbs sewn into their bodices. Men chewed mint leaves or tucked lavender sprigs under their hats. I remember one market day when a vendor swore that rubbing onions under the arms would drive away both foul odors and evil spirits. I can't say it worked, but no one came close enough to find out. In my youth, I met an old miller who claimed to bathe only twice a year, once on St. John's feast day, and again when the river flooded so badly it carried him away, clothes and all. And he wasn't an exception. The annual or semi-annual bath was an event. Water was drawn from the well, heated in a cauldron, poured into a tub that, if you were lucky, had been emptied since the last family bath. It started with the oldest and most respected, and ended more often than not with the youngest child sinking into a lukewarm soup of soap, sweat, and questionable decisions. Yet despite the rarity of baths, there was a kind of pride, a gritty, almost spiritual resistance. We weren't lacking hygiene, we lacked what you now call modern hygiene. Yes, we cleaned our hands with sand or ash, hair was combed with bone combs and dusted with flour or rose powder. Teeth? A willow twig chewed with faith and hope, and if your breath became unbearable, you simply whistled less. After all, in a time when illness lurked around every corner and doctors prescribed leeches with enthusiasm, it was safer to smell bad than risk purifying yourself too much. In church, they spoke of the soul as a temple, and the body, well, that was merely its temporary dwelling. To many, caring too much for the outer shell was a sign of vanity or a lack of faith. Saints and hermits were celebrated for their holy filth, covered in dust and humility. I remember stories of a monk who hadn't seen water in decades and was venerated for it, as if the scent of his robe was the perfume of sacrifice. Curiously, these were the same monks who, in secret, distilled rosewater and experimented with ointments made from rare roots and barks, not to cleanse themselves, of course, but for medicinal purposes. And then there was winter. Winter. The season when no one dared undress, not even for divine promises. The cold was merciless, and the idea of pouring water onto bare skin felt as absurd as sleeping without a blanket. We slept in sweaty clothes, under heavy covers scented with weeks, sometimes seasons, of use. The breeze that crept through the cracks felt as sharp as a blade, and the frozen water in the basin seemed to mock our courage. Better to smell like a stable than to turn into a frozen statue with a soul. And so we sweated in the summer and smoked ourselves through the winter, a natural cycle, almost poetic when seen from the proper distance. And yet there were moments when bathing became inevitable, a ceremony, an important visit, a wedding. On those days we brushed the dust from our shoulders and filled the tub with solemnity. The steam rose like incense, and for a few brief moments the world felt lighter. Children laughed, adults sighed, and the old just grumbled, preferring the smell of hay to that of soap. There was something sacred in that brief ritual, something that reminded us the body also deserved attention, even if only for a few hours, before returning to the dust of the fields and the soot of the kitchens. Among the wealthy, the rules were different. There were bath chambers, scents imported from the east, and servants heating water in polished copper jugs, ladies washed with milk and lavender, lords soaked in carved tubs surrounded by columns and windows draped in linen curtains. But even there, caution remained. A full bath was rare. Washing one's hands, face, and maybe the feet was acceptable. The rest, a risk few took without the encouragement of a doctor, a priest, or a particularly insistent plague. And even these elite baths could not hide the truth that in the end we were all siblings beneath the same dusty and aromatically ambiguous sky. Today, when I recall those times, I feel a strange tenderness. The dirt, the sweat, the raw aromas of life all seem part of a forgotten harmony, an acceptance of the body as it was, limited, resilient, real. Smelling good was nice, but survival was better. And in a way, there was poetry in that. An entire village could come together around the scent of a lit oven, the warmth of a shared bath, the muffled laughter when someone slipped in the tub. The world wasn't clean, but it was alive, and that was enough. So tonight, as you lie down beneath blankets that smell neither of hay nor smoke, perhaps smile at the thought of a time when bathing was an event, perfume was onion, and cleanliness, above all, was a matter of intention. Close your eyes, breathe deep. And if by chance you dream of a medieval bathhouse with warm water, rare soap, and a touch of lavender, just remember to be grateful you're sleeping in the right century. You've just lost your job in the Middle Ages. Good luck. I remember well the day my lord, a man with a rough voice and boots cleaner than his soul, decided I was expendable. There was no anger in the announcement, not even a dramatic gesture, just a dry sentence uttered as he bit into a piece of cheese hard as fate. We no longer need you. And there I stood, on the threshold of the stable, hands empty, hat crushed between my fingers, and a silence colder than the autumn wind. The fields around me remained unchanged, but inside something had dimmed, not out of fury, but uncertainty. Because in the Middle Ages, losing your work wasn't just a setback, it was a summons to a struggle the world didn't even bother to name. In the days that followed, I wandered aimlessly along the beaten paths, the same ones I once walked with purpose, herding sheep or delivering tools to the blacksmith. But now, each step echoed more deeply, as if the gravel beneath my boots murmured doubts of its own. The world didn't stop for our misery. The church bells still rang, calling for morning mass, and the village smokehouse still sent up its thick haze of damp wood and modest supper. But to me, time felt suspended. a pause between the life I had known and the void that now opened ahead. Unlike today, there was no such word as unemployed. There were only two kinds of people, those who served a function, even a miserable one, and those who were no longer seen as useful. And the latter, well, they were left to chance. Some left in search of another fiefdom, hoping some lord somewhere needed arms to weed, lay stones or guard chickens. But there was not always room for one more stranger, especially one without a trade or a recommendation. Others, more desperate, headed into the forests, not to hunt, for that was a nobleman's right, but to survive on what the woods let slip: roots, timid mushrooms, maybe a thin fish in a dark stream. There were also those like me who hesitated between leaving and staying. Hope is a weak flame, but a stubborn one, and even in uncertainty, many of us still looked to the church tower as if answers might be hidden there. On some afternoons, I would sit near the village gate, pretending to stitch a piece of leather or clean tools that no longer had an owner. It was a silent way of saying, "I'm still here." Sometimes an old woman would let a piece of bread fall as she passed. Other times, nothing. But even silence, when repeated day after day, begins to carry the weight of a sentence. With time, I began to understand what it meant to live on the margins. The medieval world held no compassion for idleness. If you weren't working, you were surely sinning, and if you weren't paying taxes, you were surely stealing. The collectors came now and then, their dark cloaks fluttering like omens, demanding tribute for land I no longer held, for harvests I had never touched. Saying I have nothing was useless. They would write my name on stained parchment and move on, leaving only the warning, "Next time bring something, or someone will bring it for you." Oh, as if, even with nothing, I still owed everything. It was on one of those grey afternoons, as the wind danced through the threads of my old cloak, that I met Alric, a craftsman with calloused hands and eyes that carried the weariness of many winters. He too had been dismissed, a tanner whose workshop was given to a feudal lord's nephew. "No need to keep two when one can be exploited," the steward had said with his usual chill. Alric, however, did not beg. He carved small objects from wood, spoons, charms, saints, and traded them for food, shelter, or just a dry place to rest his bones. It was he who taught me that usefulness sometimes could be reinvented. Together, we began to wander from fair to fair, offering our humble skills. I sharpened tools with a stone inherited from my grandfather. Alric sold his talismans, carved with the devotion of a man shaping his own luck. The coins came slowly, like leaves blown in by fate. We slept under barns, in forgotten cellars, or beneath the protection of generous monks. Hunger still visited us, yes, but each day, less often. And when the bells of a new village rang in the distance, it was no longer a reminder of what we had lost, but an invitation, a chance to belong, if only for a night. The roads over time became our home. We came to know the shortcuts through the woods, the best places to find dry kindling, and which monasteries offered warm soup in exchange for silence and prayers. There was beauty in these small gestures. A friar leaving bread on the windowsill at dusk, a woman pretending to have dropped an apple so we might find it. We were not invisible. We were part of the village's hidden tapestry, those who lived on the edges, but somehow held up the center through our absence. Some nights were harsher than others. The cold slipped beneath the blankets like an old thief, and hunger bit with teeth sharper than the wolves in the woods. But on those nights, more than ever, there were stories. Alric would tell legends of forgotten kings, of blacksmiths who spoke with the wind, of stars that guided wanderers toward destinies they didn't yet know how to wish for. I listened in silence, my gaze lost in the embers of our makeshift fire, allowing myself just for a while to believe there might be something more ahead. Perhaps not gold, or land, or fulfilled promises, but peace. And for someone who had lost everything, that was enough to keep walking. Time passed without hurry, like the streams we crossed in our wanderings. sometimes gentle, sometimes too cold to ford without trembling to the bone. And with it, the pain of being cast aside slowly turned into something else. Not quite relief, but a quiet, tender acceptance. I began to understand that on the days I thought I had lost everything, life was merely inviting me to see differently. I no longer saw the fairs as just markets, but as feasts of survival. Coins, once painfully scarce, became part of a dance. Sometimes they came, sometimes they didn't, but the steps went on all the same. There was one village in particular, forgotten between hills and small vineyards, where we stayed longer. Ulrich found work mending fences and carving crosses for the graves in the churchyard. I helped the miller carry sacks of wheat, and in return I received hot soup and a dry place to sleep. We were no longer seen as strangers. We were simply useful, and in that world, being useful was the closest thing to belonging. At night, sometimes, we heard the chapel bells in the distance, announcing a mass, a wedding, or even a farewell. And I wondered how many of those lives had begun with loss, like mine. How many silent stories bloomed from the ruins of what seemed like an ending, but was only the beginning of a different way of living. It was in that village, beneath the ever-grey sky of autumn, that Ulrich chose to stay. His knees no longer responded as they once had, and the cough that visited him on cold mornings had become a constant companion. He found a corner in the stable of a kind widower, and there he remained, surrounded by wood shavings, worn tools, and children who came to admire the figures he carved. On the day I left, he gave me a simple amulet, a small oak leaf, carved by hand, and said, "Not all winds carry you away. Some simply show another path." And I continued on with light steps, the amulet hanging from a cord at my chest, and my heart warmed by memories that, not long ago, still felt like wounds. I discovered there are many ways to walk through the world, and not all of them require a clear road or a certain destination. Some paths slip through the cracks in stone walls, through forgotten trails, through the silence between other people's words. And when someone asked me where I came from, I would smile softly and answer, "From where I was let go." Because losing a job in the Middle Ages wasn't just losing one's livelihood. It was being cast into a sea of uncertainty, where each new day might be a shipwreck or an island. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it was a shelter. Today, when I think of those days, I no longer feel the weight of shame, nor the chill of abandonment. I feel the rough texture of the cloth we used for blankets, the simple aroma of turnip soup shared by the fire, and the quiet warmth of a kind word spoken at just the right moment. Life beyond the walls of the manor was hard, yes, but it was also wider, freer. I discovered there was a world beyond the Lord's fields, that there were people who smiled without needing to measure your usefulness, and that in the end, even the absence of a place could become a kind of home. And if you, dream traveler, ever find yourself lost in the mists of time, without a role, without a direction, perhaps even without a name, know that there are paths that only reveal themselves to those willing to wander. The Middle Ages were harsh on those who fell, but even among the stones and the mud, stories were born, friendships took root, and small joys whispered through the wind. And when night fell over the fields and the bells went silent, there was always a fire lit somewhere, a bench to share, and the quiet promise that as long as there is road beneath your feet, there is still time to begin again. Good night, and may your dreams find shelter in the memories the world forgot. And so we end another journey, through echoes of a past where even hardship carried the sound of footsteps on damp earth and the scent of day-old bread. Thank you for walking with me through these ancient recollections, where even loss found the shape of poetry and quiet resilience. May this night bring you rest, like the distant song of a cricket or the soft creak of an old mill in the dark. And may you remember, as you close your eyes, even on the most uncertain days, there is always a flame that endures, small, flickering, but alive. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow, the road continues. And I'll be here whenever you're ready to hear another story. How to throw a medieval feast without going bankrupt or getting sick. I recall a particularly restless night when I was summoned to help prepare a banquet, one that promised to be as much a spectacle of excess as it was a dangerous choreography of hidden intentions. The castle, though imposing, carried a faint scent of vinegar and ambition. Through the tall windows, the cold autumn wind brought with it the aroma of seasoned meat and freshly baked bread, but also the scurrying rustle of rats in the cupboards, always the first to know the menu. There were too many candles, too many people, and far too little time. And still, no one dared suggest that perhaps a simple broth made more sense than a swan stuffed with almonds and honey. Inside, the kitchen resembled a vision torn between a fever dream and divine punishment. Cauldrons boiled with liquids of uncertain color, servants collided with slippery trays, and the head cook, a man of few words and many grunts, shouted orders amid smoke and the acrid smell of burnt garlic. There was a turkey stuffed with smaller birds, which themselves hid spices so rare no one knew for certain whether they were edible or merely decorative. Every dish had to do more than please the palate. It had to impress, or at least distract, any guest harboring questionable political ambitions. The selection of ingredients was a craft driven as much by vanity as by superstition. Oysters, goose tongues, meat pies shaped into allegorical creatures. Everything had to look opulent, even if the taste betrayed a certain creative despair. There was a liver pudding, whose recipe called for 4 kinds of fat, 3 types of wine, and 1 Latin prayer, not necessarily in that order. The goal was not simply to satisfy, but to display power, status, and, with luck, avoid anyone leaving with suspicions of poisoning, at least not immediate ones. As night fell and torches were lit, the halls filled with an anxious murmur, a mix of hunger and curiosity. Guests arrived wrapped in heavy cloaks and strong perfumes, likely to mask the ever-present memory of manure every medieval road carried. They sat at long tables draped with embroidered cloths that hid stains from past feasts and crumbs of political secrets. And between a goblet of mead and a piece of hard bread, the true show began. A parade of dishes as elaborate as they were impractical. There was a boar decorated with peacock feathers and glass eyes, a fish pie with more bones than meat, and a wine infused with rose petals and quiet desperation. The dishes moved among the guests like suspicious gifts, and each bite was accompanied by sidelong glances, restrained laughter, and the occasional palpitation of doubt. Eating was an act of faith. Refusing was an offense. And so everyone chewed with the composure of hopeful condemned souls, while musicians played slightly out-of-tune songs in the background, trying to mask the subtle complaints of uneasy stomachs. Not everything, however, was a threat to digestion. There were genuine moments of delight, like the sweet bread filled with dates and walnuts, served warm, or the cheeses spiced with herbs that grew only on the monastery's northern wall. These small bursts of flavor seemed to remind the guests that despite the extravagance and discreet schemes, there was beauty in simplicity. Still, it was wise to eat slowly, sparingly, and never take the first bite. An unwritten rule passed among the seasoned, as important as knowing who was seated to your left. As the night wore on, came the dancing, not rehearsed but spontaneous, as if each person were trying to digest with their feet what their stomachs no longer understood. Laughter grew, toasts became frequent, and the wine, now warm, seemed to gain magical or dangerously laxative properties depending on the barrel. Between exaggerated tales and improvised flattery, a fuzzy sense settled in that somehow, despite everything, it was all working out. At least until someone tripped over a platter or revealed a secret the wine deemed prudent to share. When the banquet finally began to fade, and the plates returned to the kitchen, with bones stacked like little funeral pyres, dessert appeared, or something going by that name. Dried fruits hardened by time, honey cakes as dense as enchanted bricks, and sugar-coated seeds more suited to cracking teeth than sweetening the night. Still, they were eagerly fought over, as they marked the end of a meal that, if not entirely safe, had at least been memorable. Some claimed the sweets helped disguise any suspicious flavor missed in the main course, and then came the farewells, discreet or boisterous, depending on the alcohol content and the degree of mutual resentment. Those who could, left before digestion demanded its toll. Those who couldn't pretended to feel a sudden urge to contemplate the stars in the courtyard, where the fresh air might or might not bring relief. The servants cleaned the hall in silence, gathering bones, forgotten coins, and the whispered conspiracies shared between goblets. The cook, exhausted and triumphant, doused the last fire with the quiet pride of having once again dodged disaster, and perhaps fed a dream or two. And so, when the candles burned low and silence returned to settle among the smoke-stained tapestries, only the echo remained, of distant laughter and poorly washed dishes. The banquet, like so many before it, had not been perfect, but that was never the expectation. In times as unpredictable as a noble's mood or the balance of a chicken in the sacristy, gathering to feast in excess was a gesture of hope, a stubborn declaration that despite danger and debt, one could still celebrate, even if only for a night. I remember slipping out through one of the side doors, my stomach slightly uneasy, but my heart light. The early morning air smelled of damp earth and crushed leaves, and in the distance one could still hear the clinking of the last goblets being stacked. The sky, dark and speckled with stars, seemed to approve of the fleeting excess of the men below. And there, between the chill of the night and the lingering warmth of a feast already turning to memory, I understood the secret of medieval celebrations. They were not about abundance nor status, but about defying, with a full plate and one extra sip, the ever-looming shadow of scarcity. You've been arrested in a medieval town, now what? I remember that pale morning well, when dew still clung to the stones of the marketplace, and the scent of freshly baked bread barely competed with the persistent aroma of the stables. I was there, as always, watching life unfold in its familiar rhythm, when 3 men bearing the Count's crest appeared among the crowd like crows in search of misfortune. One of them pointed at me, and in the blink of an eye I was being led away, not violently, but with a quiet urgency, as though even injustice had a protocol to follow. They didn't know my name, they gave no reason, and yet every eye followed me, as if guilt were a visible cloak sewn into my worn coat. I was taken through streets I knew by heart, but which now seemed to stretch and narrow like a bad dream. Passing under the arch of the old wall, I realized the sounds of the world, the bells, the laughter, the footsteps, had stayed behind. The town jail, if it could be called that, was a low, damp structure that smelled of old straw and rust. Inside, a sleepy scribe wrote down my name with a quill that creaked louder than the gates. And it was there, between a stone cubicle and the disgruntled bleating of a goat who apparently shared my cell, that I understood. Justice in this city wasn't blind. It simply wore a blindfold to pretend it wasn't laughing. The first night passed slowly, as if each hour carried the weight of a trial. The floor was cold, made of stones rounded by time, and the only comfort came from a bundle of damp straw that creaked beneath my movements. The goat, who apparently stood accused in more cases than many local judges, slept soundly, as if he knew no crime was worth rushing. I, however, did not sleep. There were noises, chains dragging, muffled voices, a distant moan that could have been a prisoner or the wind, and in doubt, the soul trembled just the same. No one explained the reason for my arrest. They simply said, "The Lord seeks clarification." And in the 14th century, that phrase was anything but promising. The next morning, I was removed from my cell by two guards wearing mail just as worn as their expressions. The clarification came in the form of an interrogation, conducted by a man who introduced himself as a judge, though he dressed more like a butcher on market day. Instead of questions, he offered choices, silence or pain. And there I learned that in the medieval courtroom, truth was not sought, it was extracted. Through levers, weights and ropes that knew the human body better than any physician, I was expected to confess. To something, anything. Because in that room, not confessing made you seem more guilty. And confessing, well, at least it gave the scribe something to write down. So I confessed, not to a real crime, but to something vague, as many did. Yes, perhaps I spoke ill of the Count in the tavern. A useful phrase, serious enough to justify my condition, vague enough to avoid a noose. The judge nodded as if he had heard the same line dozens of times and gestured for them to take me back. Punishment would come, of course, because in their world, suffering was not a means, but part of the verdict. And even if innocent, or especially because of it, someone had to pay. Medieval justice wasn't built on scales, but on improvised balances, where public order was maintained through fear and the crooked backs of those without surnames. In the following days, I remained in the cell, listening to other prisoners arrive and leave like ghosts in transit. There was an herb seller accused of witchcraft for curing a headache too quickly. A boy arrested for stealing an apple, which he claimed had fallen off the cart on its own, and a pregnant woman, silent, whom no one dared look in the eye. The guard who watched over us had a crooked nose and a questionable taste in songs, but brought us stale bread and thin broth with some regularity, which made us respect him as if he were a saint. And between the clank of locks and the silence of the days, I began to understand that prison, in those times, was not just a place. It was a weight, a limbo, a punishment that stretched on, even when the sentence had yet to be named. One afternoon, without warning, I was summoned before a magistrate. Not the same one from the interrogation. That one seemed more like an executioner with borrowed titles. This was another, dressed in clean robes, gold rings, and with the bored expression of a man who had judged many cases but understood few. He read my confession aloud, shook his head as if the ending were already known, and declared 3 days in the pillory, followed by a fine and a formal warning. No whips, no gallows. A relief in its own way. But also a subtle lesson. Public humiliation was preferred to quiet justice. To be exposed in the square with your face to the sun and your shame on display was the kind of theater that satisfied the town. And so I was led in a modest procession to the center of the village. There, they bound my wrists and neck to the old wooden stock, worn smooth by the weight of countless other embarrassed faces. Some children threw scraps of vegetables, a man laughed too loudly, and an old woman crossed herself with regret. The sun burned my skin, but time passed slower than in the cell, and while I stood there, unmoving, a piece of the town's furniture of shame, I realized my story wasn't unique. It was just another cog in the crooked machine they called justice, a system where error was inevitable and innocence, more often than not, irrelevant. The morning after my last day in the pillory, I was released without ceremony, as if I'd never been arrested. No one handed me a paper, no one apologized. They simply opened the wooden gate with a creak and pointed down the street with a nod. My legs still trembled, and my pride was more bruised than my wrists. The town looked the same. The smell of bread, the merchants' cries, the barking dogs. But to me, everything felt distant, as if I now walked through a place I no longer belonged to. And strangely enough, there was a kind of freedom in that exclusion, a cold certainty that having survived the justice of men, I had seen the worst they had to offer. I returned home, or what was left of it, and found silence waiting for me. No neighbor knocked on the door, but I saw curtains move, eyes peeking through shutters. In a medieval village, reputation was as fragile as a loose roof tile. One accusation, and it flew off with the wind, never to return. Still, I sat before the cold hearth, warming my hands over the embers of memory, and accepted what had happened as part of something greater. Because in those days, being accused was almost a rite of passage, and being innocent, well, that was just a detail no one bothered to verify. As the weeks passed, the village forgot. Not because they forgave me, but because another scandal took over their conversations. A missing horse, a quarrelsome blacksmith, a priest who overslept. The wheel kept turning, indifferent to the stories it crushed beneath its weight. I returned to my simple tasks, sweeping the courtyard, mending a worn cloak, feeding the cat, who never left my side, even when everyone else turned away. And in the midst of that quiet routine, something began to bloom. Not anger, not revenge, but a kind of sad, serene wisdom. The quiet understanding that in the medieval world, justice was less a promise and more a gamble. Today, when the wind slips through the window and the fire crackles softly in the corner, I like to close my eyes and listen, not to the voices that once judged me, but to the older whispers. The ones that say even the darkest night will one day yield to the ember that refuses to die out. That even beneath the chains of injustice, there is room to remember, to breathe, and to go on. Because surviving back then wasn't just about living one more day. It was about keeping stories safe, quietly, until someday someone, like you now, wished to hear them as night began to fall. A day in the life of a medieval beggar. I remember a cold morning when the sky still hesitated between mist and light, and I was already seated beside the stone bridge, feet tucked beneath a worn tunic, hands stretched out like empty offerings to the day that was just beginning. The ground beneath me was hard, but familiar. The sound of cartwheels blended with the distant chant of a monk in procession, and the damp scent of the stones wrapped around me like an old cloak. I was a beggar, not by choice, but by circumstance. And my trade, if I may call it that, was to tell sad stories with eyes deep enough to evoke pity, but not so deep as to cause revulsion. At the time, knowing how to fake a convincing cough or hold a distant gaze, as if lost in some long-buried pain, was worth more than any coin tossed my way. There were days I pretended to limp, others to be blind in one eye. Never both at once. Exaggeration ruined credibility. The art of begging was a subtle dance between despair and performance. And believe me, nothing tested my creativity more than sharing a corner with a Franciscan friar. They, with their frayed robes and serene eyes, collected alms with the same silence I used to awaken compassion. Holy competition, but competition all the same. There was a specific spot near the entrance to the market where coins seemed more willing to fall from passers-by's hands. A space fought over as if it were fertile land. Arriving early was essential, though it didn't always guarantee you'd keep the spot. I'd once been ousted by an elderly man with a limp who, in a trembling voice and with precise rhetoric, convinced me he'd held that post since the time of the previous king. He spoke with such dignity that for a moment I myself felt like the usurper. I gave up the place and went searching for another corner, one where pigeons outnumbered people. On feast days, when bells rang out with joy and families dressed their best, hope ran higher. Small children, upon seeing my figure sitting with a clay bowl in my lap and a leg wrapped in strategically dirty cloth, tugged at their mother's skirts, asking them to give a coin. Some did so kindly. Others cast me a quick glance, as if my presence reminded them of something they'd rather not remember. It was a game of chance and timing, the precise moment to raise my eyes, to let my voice falter in greeting, and then wait. Waiting was, perhaps, the true profession. There were tricks, of course. A good beggar knew how to rotate his stories to avoid boring the audience. I had three that worked well: the wounded soldier, the farmer who lost everything in a fire, and the devoted son of a sick mother in need of medicine. Each demanded a different tone, a distinct gaze, a careful rhythm of breath. One day, a merchant approached, left a silver coin, a rare thing, and whispered, "The sick mother moves me most. Stick with that one." I smiled, thanked him, and mentally noted that the tears should come right after the second sigh, not before. Now and then, someone wanted more than to drop a coin. One winter, an old man sat beside me with a warm loaf wrapped in cloth. He said he had lived on the streets too, but in another city, back when kings wore beards and knights held no stars. We ate in silence, sharing not just the bread, but the quiet peace of those who no longer needed to explain themselves. It wasn't charity, it was recognition. And for a moment, on that cold stone pavement, I was more than a beggar. I was remembered. Not every encounter was kind. There were the boys who threw stones to see if I really limped, or the drunkards who spat in my bowl for fun. I learned to retreat in those moments, to lower my eyes and mumble something about divine forgiveness, even if inside my stomach burned more with rage than hunger. In that life, dignity was a thin blanket. Stretch it too far and it tore. Hold it too close and the cold crept into your soul. I folded it carefully, day after day, between the lines of my pretending. At dusk, as the shadows stretched along the streets and the evening bells called for prayers, I gathered what I had earned. A few copper coins, a piece of hardened bread, sometimes a look of pity that still warmed from within. I walked then to a narrow alley, where others like me huddled beneath the worn arches of the city walls. We shared whispered stories, divided crumbs, and laughed, yes, laughed, at life, at the nobles, at the illnesses real and imagined. Because laughter, in that place, was perhaps the last luxury no one could take from us. At night, the city slept with one eye open. Candles went out behind windows, but dogs barked, rats ran freely, and we, the invisible ones, found shelter wherever there was a gap, a shadow, or a stone less sharp. I wrapped myself in my threadbare cloak, using my own arm sack as a pillow, and looked up at the sky when the clouds allowed. On clear nights, I counted the stars like a man counts unfulfilled promises. One for every path not taken, every face that didn't see me, every whispered mercy forgotten before sunrise. And still, there was something sweet in that abandonment. Perhaps it was the strange freedom of owing nothing to anyone, of carrying no titles, no debts, no expectations. Or maybe it was just the quiet comfort of knowing that even at the margins, I existed. And that was already something in a world that demanded so much just to consider you alive. When sleep came, it was light as a whisper. And in dreams, rare and scattered, I was not a beggar. I was just a man walking through a golden field where no one had to fake a wound to be seen. The next morning, the city woke before the sun. The carts began to creak once more, the bells called for the first mass, and I, as always, gathered my rags, cracked my joints, and prepared for another day of rehearsal. It was a silent theatre, where every gesture was measured, every expression choreographed to touch the right heart at the right moment. And though the hunger was real, the pain sometimes wasn't, or rather it was a different kind. The pain of being ignored when you weren't convincing enough, or realizing that even compassion had a daily limit. But I carried on, because there was beauty, however quiet, in being an invisible part of the city, in hearing other people's stories without them knowing I was listening, in watching the ebb and flow of life with tired, yet still watchful eyes. And at the end of the day, when I returned to my stone beneath the arch, with coins in my pocket and dust on my feet, I would murmur a wordless prayer, not for a miracle, but simply for one more tomorrow. And it always came, silent, cold, and mine.